Thank you. I'd like to call this work session to order on AO 2021-10 and 2021-13, interim appointment to fill an assembly seat. Let's go ahead and start with the roll call, please.
Miss Allard?
Here.
Mr. Constant? Sorry, Mr. Constant? Okay, Mr. Dunbar? Miss Kennedy?
Here.
Ms. LaFrance?
Here.
Mr. Presberdia?
Here.
Mr. Peterson?
Present.
Mr. Rivera?
Present.
Mr. Weddleton?
Here.
I do see Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Weddleton, you might be on mute.
Oh, he stated here.
I am here.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Ms. Zolotel?
Here.
Thank you.
I'm
Thank
here,
you.
Mr. Chair.
Oh, great. Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. All right. Thank you. Please put yourself in the chat or text me if you can't access the chat. So for today's work session, we're going to start off with the ordinance put forward by, Mr. Perez-Rudia, and then see if there are any questions from there. And then we will turn to the resolution put forward by Assembly members Kennedy and Allard and see if we have any questions there. And then we will wrap up the work session. So go ahead, Mr. Perez-Rudia. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hopefully everybody has had an opportunity to read it, so I won't go through it in much detail, but I will just give some context around it. First, I think we may have some people on the call from different community councils. If not, maybe they can listen to this later. An early version of this ordinance did go to the Spenard Community Council, and they put forth a resolution to support it. There has been some changes from that original approval. It also went before the Sand Lake Community Council, and also the resolution we're going to be looking at next went before the Sand Lake Community Council, and they chose to support the resolution that you'll hear about later. The Turnagain Community Council has not weighed in one way or the other, so I want to just sort of share that. The basic idea here is that our charter does not allow in terms of the closed definitions of what a vacancy is, does not consider when the chair of the assembly moves into the temporary position of the mayor, that is considered a vacancy. So what this does is it adds language to our code so that in that circumstance, the assembly can appoint somebody to temporarily fill that spot while the chair is serving temporarily in the mayor role. It restricts that person from becoming the vice chair or chair during their time. And it uses the existing process that we have for filling a vacancy, even though this is not considered a vacancy, to fill that spot. And so I think the idea of this work session, my hope was that we, I think Member Allard and Kennedy and myself all have very similar goal in that trying to find a way to have someone fill that spot, to make sure that there is an additional vote and make sure that there's an additional person to represent the people of the West Side while the chair temporarily fills the mayor role. It's just two different ways, I think, of doing it, and two different approaches. So our hope today was to answer any questions and have a conversation and hopefully find a path forward that we can that the majority of the assembly can agree on, and we can move forward. I would also just say that I have had a number of concerns from the community around, whether this position should be appointed or whether there should be this position should be elected. And I would just say that I think that the circumstances surrounding the temporary appointment to the mayor this round is likely to happen again. And I think that the right way to do this is to put it into our code to create a process, and that we need to create enough flexibility for the assembly to appoint or not to appoint based on what is going on at that time. So I think that's probably all I want to say at this point. My hope is that we can find some clarity with these two proposals, and we can find the right path forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you. I want to note for the record, we've been joined by Mr. Constant. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and go into discussion specific to the ordinance put forward by Mr. Perez-Verdia, and then after we're done with that discussion, we'll have Ms. Kennedy and Ms. Allard speak to their resolution. So go ahead, Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the presentation that Mr. Perez-Verdia just gave. To me, it makes more intuitive sense that you would put something like this in code rather than resolution, because this happened not too long ago when Mayor Begich was elected to the Senate. It's happening again now. I think it's likely to happen again some point in the future. And it strikes me as easier to defend something legally if it's in code rather than us sort of declaring we have a power and then doing it. But I will say my question for the attorneys and Mr. Gates and the Muni Legal Department, if they're on, it strikes me that whether it's the ordinance or the resolution or even a special election, it seems like all three would have the same challenge under the charter, which is the charter says there are 11 assembly members. Well, it will say 12 soon, but there are 11 assembly members at the moment. So can you walk us through how any of those methods would get around that? Because, under the charter, the letter of the law of the charter, there is no vacancy, and Austin Quinn Davidson is still on the assembly. Can Dean or Kate, I'm not sure who's on, can one of the legal team speak to that?
Mr. Gates?
Hello. Actually, I'm not sure if Mrs. Vogel is here in the room. And I just wanted to make sure I understood the exact question. I'm sorry, because I was looking to see if she was here. I missed a part of it. And this is whether it's more legally defensible in code or if we still have an issue because of the charter saying 11 members. And if this would be like a 12th, or could you rephrase or state the question again?
Right. Well, to me, it seems like code would be stronger than resolution, but it doesn't seem like there'd be too much of a difference. But it seems like, I guess my question is just, can you walk us through the reasoning about how any of those ways to fill this seat would not run afoul of the code of the charter?
Well, at the last meeting, I think both myself and Mrs. Vogel stated our opinion that neither of these approaches are perfect. And you're right, they both are a different way to get to the same results, which is having an appointee temporarily fill in. I think that, and we had both said at that time that the charter's really silent on this as to whether it's prohibited or allowed. And but because the Assembly has all legislative powers not prohibited by charter, I would argue you have this power because it's not prohibited by charter. So you can do this. But I think the real question you're asking is, well, either way, the charter does say that the legislative power is vested in 11 Assembly members. And with either of these proposals, we're appointing someone to fill a seat that isn't actually vacant because Mrs. Quinn Davidson is still Assembly Chair, who's serving as acting mayor. She's unavailable. So she's still an 11th Assembly member, and we're appointing someone. And I think that I could make an argument that this is not this is not creating another assembly seat. It's just creating this, because of the circumstance, creating a way for there to be 11 votes. And the one vote here is temporary appointment that is sort of a substitute. It's not a perfect argument. So, and like we have both said, there's still some legal risk here either way, the approach you take. That was one of the concerns Mrs. Vogel had stated. So if she's here, I hope she can also speak to this issue. I feel strongly, though, that because case law says that there's a presumption of validity to, you know, an ordinance or assembly legislative action, that the burden is on whoever's challenging it to prove it that this is not within your powers. I believe it is because of all the legislative powers you have by law as a home rule municipality, and there's no express prohibition. I don't think there's an implied prohibition here. I think that's sort of the legal argument that that you're positing here. Is there an implied prohibition on these because the charter says 11 assembly members? But again, I don't think that when, you know, let me make a comparison to the two instances in the recent past years. We've appointed persons to fill vacancies in assembly seats, both when Mr. Steele resigned and when Mrs. Dembowski left her seat early to join the state government. And in both of those, we had an appointment that was authorized by charter and code. But those appointments of Mr. Perman and Mrs. Weinhoff, they were not assembly members. They were appointed to fill an assembly seat. I would say, you know, sort of similar here, we're not appointing someone to be an assembly member, we're appointing someone to fill a seat. So I guess that's sort of nuanced, but I think that it is within our powers and it is consistent with how appointments are viewed when they are appointed to fill a vacancy. So a good question, Mr. Dunbar, and hopefully Mrs. Vogel is with us now. She might speak to this as well.
Thank you. So I don't see Mrs. Vogel, but I do see Miss Willoughby. Did you want to add anything on?
Through the chair, this is Miss Willoughby. I don't think I can state a position for the Department of Law, and I'm messaging Miss Vogel to see if she'll be joining the conversation.
Great, thank you. Anything else, Mr. Dunbar?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
I actually think Mr. Dunbar got the question I was going to ask to Mr. Gates, and is this even legal? Because it definitely seems questionable in relationship to what the charter says, but if we operate on a baseline of it is legal, I'm prepared to just continue and hear the presentation.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
Yeah, sorry, being slow there. I guess this has been somewhat addressed, but I just want to make sure I understand these right. I mean, both the AR and the AO get us to the same place on the same schedule, but the difference is the AR, just the phrasing hinges on calling it a vacancy, which the charter says it's not. So I mean, I guess when Crystal and Jamie speak, maybe just say, I mean, if the other one's chosen, are you okay with yours not? Or, I guess make a pitch why yours would be better. Thanks. So I can wait for an answer from them.
Yeah, thanks. We will do that once we're done with our current queue, then we will do that presentation. So let's save any of that for after we're done with our current queue. Ms. LaFrance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The first part of my question has been addressed, and that was concerning the legality. The second part is, what happens should this AO or resolution or both pass? What happens if the legality is challenged? Would that mean not to jump ahead, but I just like to know what the worst case scenario would be. if it would include like an invalidation of actions, legislative actions, or what that would look like. Thanks.
I guess that's a question for an attorney.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Gates.
And I do need to say that in my role as Assembly Counsel, I don't handle litigation. That's the Department of Law. So for that question specifically, I really think I need to defer to the Department of Law. I think that I would say, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, there's that presumption of validity to Assembly actions. And all of the votes the Assembly takes hereafter, whichever one passes. And if somebody's pointed to fill, if there's a close vote, that's 6-5, for example, there's still that presumption of validity, and oftentimes, well, there might be challenges that will be worked out in litigation, though, and sometimes courts will not undo something that would cause too much harm or damage to undo. Well, maybe I can speak to this later after I kind of figure out how I'm wording my response better, or invite the Department of Law, since they would be handling litigation there. So as we had both said in the past, though, this is not without its legal risk. I think the legal risk is quite minimal, but it's there, as you're asking. And then I sort of had asked to speak, to comment on what Mr. Weddleton said recently, if I may.
Actually, I have one other person before you, Mr. Gates, in the queue. Miss Allard?
Sure.
Thank you. So this is kind of unexpected, but I did speak to Ms. Kennedy a few seconds ago, and I see where there could be some legality issues with this. And if we went back, all of us as a team, and we go back and we say, okay, what kind of triggered this? Maybe it was the writing of the charter of the special election for the mayoral race. And had it been really locked in at the understanding of the special election, we could have avoided all this. So I'm going to throw this out there, since we are in a work session, to say maybe we could go back to the drawing board, figure out what special election, put in the fine tuning when and where and if we have a special election, in case there's a vacated, a mayor is for some reason resigns or vacates the seat. What if we address that? And if Cameron is willing and Ms. Kennedy is willing, I'm willing to pull this off the table, let it go, leave the seat the way it is. And the only reason I also want to bring this up, it wasn't just one or two people who contacted us about the vacated seat. Once it gets up to about a half a dozen to a dozen people, that's where it becomes concerning. I don't want to put any of the assembly members, myself, the administration, into a legal ramble with anything. So if this is an option for Cameron and Crystal and the rest of the assembly, maybe we just leave this on the side and focus on, okay, how can we make sure that the wording for a special election in regards to a mayoral race, how do we do that if that particular mayor resigns, like I said? So I'm open for that conversation, and if you have any questions, I'm here.
Thank you. Mr. Gates?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Recently, when Mr. Weddleton was speaking about the two proposals, the AR 2021-13, AO 2021-10, he described the resolution as calling this a vacancy. And I just wanted to make a correction there. We had Mrs. Allard's, I guess, proposed resolution December 22nd for the body. That one called it a vacancy. But this is a different resolution that was submitted for January 12th and postponed to the 26th. It's a different resolution. It's been reworked quite a bit. And this resolution doesn't call it a vacancy, but it does refer to the process for a vacancy that's in charter and so forth. It doesn't actually call Ms. Quinn Davidson's assembly seat a vacancy in it. So it's a little bit different than what you maybe remember from December. And then I think someone mentioned, what if both of them pass? And I think that you wouldn't want to pass both the resolution and the ordinance. I mean, they both have different approaches to get to the same result in a way, but I think it would just be messy if we passed them both. So I wouldn't recommend that. We do have a resolution that's going to be on the addendum, and that was just completed today, that I hope is before you. But whether the resolution or the ordinance pass, we have this additional resolution on the addendum that initiates the appointment process. And it doesn't matter which of these pass. This new resolution on the addendum would say, if one of these pass, then we're initiating the process, and here's the date for applications and the meeting where the assembly will do an appointment. And I just wanted to make sure you're aware of that, since it was just recently completed.
Great, thank you. So in the queue, I have Mr. Perez-Verdia, Mr. Dunbar, Mr. Constant, myself, and then Mr. Weddleton. After that, I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Kennedy and Ms. Allard if they would like to speak to their resolution. So go ahead, Mr. Perez-Verdia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I guess I want to go back a bit, and then I have just a couple of comments about what was said, and that is that currently, based on the legal opinion that we've received, when we find ourselves in this position again, where if the mayor were to step down and we have the chair step into the temporary mayor role, and we make the decision, because it's our choice whether to have a special election or not, based on whatever factors, whether it's timing or whether it's whatever else, that we should not have a special election. Therefore, that person who's in the temporary mayor role is going to be there for whatever period of time. What this does is this gives us the ability to put somebody temporarily into that role. I do think this is going to happen to us again, and I think this in a very thoughtful way fixes that. I would also just say that I was in a meeting with Ms. Vogel, and if she comes on, she can certainly speak, and Mr. Gates, and we had a conversation about the legality of this. And I will just share my takeaway from that, and that is that there is actually there's a very small legal risk to this, but there's a legal risk to many things that we do. So it's not abnormal for us to do something that has the potential of being legally challenged. And that the worst case scenario, from what I understand, is that if there is a 6-5 vote, and it's legally challenged, that could get overturned, and other 6-5 votes could get overturned. But again, my understanding is that the likelihood of that happening is very low, and that it is legally defensible. So I just want to say that even though we're having a lot of conversations about the legality of this, it's my understanding moving into this that there is very little legal risk, and I wouldn't have brought forward this ordinance if I felt like that there was a significant amount of legal risk. I think the last thing I would say is that I would. My intention of bringing this forward was not to address issues around the special election or any of those things. It was simply to make sure that the people of West Anchorage have that additional vote and have someone who is working to represent them during this temporary period. And I still do think that the methodology that I've brought forward is a good one, and I think it deserves to be considered. And it needs to be voted on. So I would really encourage us to move forward with it. I think of the two proposals, it's a more sound approach to solving this problem. That's it. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate everything Cameron just said. I think I agree with all of it, and we can save this for debate a little bit, but I would point out that even how we had a special election, Those things take a while to put together and run, and so there would have been a significant chunk of time when West Anchorage was didn't have the second assembly member. And in the sort of more typical, I think what we think of as a more typical situation when Mark Begich, for example, was elected, there was still, I think, 6 months, maybe 7 months in which that seat was held open while Mr. Clayman was the acting mayor. And so I think that, to the credit of Cameron and Ms. Allard, Ms. Kennedy, that they have identified a real issue here that that I think is worth putting in code. But my question, and again, I raise these legal questions because they're sort of interesting to me, and also because I think we should be cognizant of them. So for Dean or for anyone else, if there is a 6-5 vote, and that's when you think there might be a legal challenge, who would have standing to bring that, in your opinion? Would it be someone who's directly impacted? Like, let's say we passed a law that directly impacted, I don't know, a business, for example. Would it just be that business? Or if we pass sort of a generally applicable law, could anybody bring a case? Or, I guess in the third situation, we pass a specific law, but that person doesn't want to bring the case. But could any citizen of Anchorage bring the case, just on a general theory that the law is invalid? Who has standing? Yes, that's the simple way to ask that question.
Which of the attorneys would like to respond?
Is Mrs. Vogel with us now? I would first say that definitely somebody who's impacted by an ordinance passed, or resolution passed by 6-5, would have standing. As for all the other categories of persons that you mentioned, I mean, I would want to research before I give a definitive answer. I sort of think that yes, that person of the municipality, citizen, taxpayer standing, that those would probably work for standing, but there's a standing analysis that I would want to look at before I really commit to that kind of response. I also sort of wanted to add here that if there's 6-5 votes, if somebody challenges things, to challenge a specific assembly action by 6-5 vote, and the court will only rule on that specific vote on a specific motion or item, and it wouldn't be that, so everything the assembly did that was 6-5 throughout that whole time period is invalidated. People have to challenge a specific one. Courts only give relief for a specific case of controversy. Controversy being, here's an item that passed and that it's being challenged because of this appointee. And again, I think it's a legal risk that I recognize, but I don't think it's a very large legal risk, as Mr. Perez-Verdia stated. See.
No, thank you, Dean.
I believe there was one other item I wanted to mention, one other issue. I also think that having this by ordinance and put in code is a little more legally defensible than doing it by resolution. You know, it's a one-time instance, mostly because of the whole process, legislative process of putting into ordinance and so forth. But that might be, that there's a distinction. I think it's a little more legally defensible being in code and also being a more permanent solution into a code is amended again for whenever this happens in the future. But that, how big of a difference that is, I guess you could measure as a little or a lot, but I think it's a little more, or I think it's a lot more legally defensible. Someone else might say little.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Yes, thanks. Something I didn't mention in the Rules Committee this morning, and I don't know when the time is right, but probably soon-ish, is to do what was suggested by the member from Eagle River, and that is to begin a conversation about tightening up the language of filling a vacancy of the mayor. And so to that end, I do have drafted language with Dean at this point that probably is almost ready for prime time. And in some ways, this issue is tied to that question. And it might be, if we do pass this ordinance, that we need to look back at this ordinance again shortly when we come to the question of filling the vacancy of the mayor. This section of code may also need to be revised again. I don't see why that would prohibit us from moving forward if the body decided that we wanted to take this risk so that West Anchorage can have as much representation as possible. And so with that said, yeah, Okay, hear from Mr. Gates. Be great. He just put his name in the queue. Quick follow-up. Mr. Chair.
Sure, go ahead, Mr. Gates.
Yes, just speaking to what Mr. Constant said and his proposal to tighten up some language about a special election for the mayor's seat. I think that proposal wouldn't be looking at this ordinance or changing it. I believe we're looking at Title 28 and adjusting language there, just to clarify.
Okay.
But it would help overall with a situation such as one that we're in.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, I don't see anyone else in the queue for the discussion on the ordinance. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ms. Kennedy and Ms. Allard if you wanted to speak to the and present the resolution.
This is Ms. Ballard. I guess the only thing I would say is thank you for listening. Thank you for everybody chiming in. And Chris, if I could work with you on perhaps what you have coming forward with regards to a special election for mayoral race, I would love to do that. Other than that, no, thank you for hearing us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Crystal Kennedy. I'll jump in if I could, please.
Go ahead.
The ordinance, or sorry, the resolution that Ms. Allard and I put forward originally did have some questions in terms of whether or not we were filling a vacancy. So that term vacancy has really been problematic because we don't technically have one. We just have a seat by which the assembly member that holds that is inactive because obviously, assigned to a different role right now. But that, causes a lot of problems. So it was this idea of trying to do something where we could just temporarily do, like what Mr. Perez-Verdia was saying, have that representation in District 3. So this resolution really just addresses kind of this immediate need, this specific extenuating circumstance. It wasn't designed to change code or really influence code in any way. And to a certain extent, that was, in my way of thinking, was kind of the beauty behind it, was the fact that because it wasn't going against anything in code, that it wouldn't be prohibited, so it wouldn't be illegal. So there's nothing that says we can't do it. And that's why it's very carefully crafted and worded so that we don't use language that confuses it with this idea of filling a vacancy, because that's not what this is doing. This is really just trying to address a very unique situation and to do it on a very temporary basis. So very pointedly, there are dates put in here by which this temporary appointment would end. And that it doesn't require any kind of special election to fill the seat at the end of the regular temporary term. So anyway, it really is just kind of meant to be that a bit of a stopgap to try to address an issue that ordinarily shouldn't be an issue. And recognizing the fact that it does become problematic for the rest of the assembly to be one member down. And we've seen some of that in some of the confusion with whether or not a vote passes, or just dealing with chairmanships of committees. And certainly the community members from District 3 have expressed their concerns about it, as well as the current sitting and active member of District 3 saying, it is harder to do all the things that you need to do to represent your community when you're, when you're only half full or half up. So anyway, I absolutely understand that this is, it's complicated. It's hard to say that we're doing something that won't be legally challenged, because I have my concerns about that as well. And I would say that I would agree with Mr. Perez-Verdia that there's a very small risk of some kind of lawsuit. But at the same time, I can see how if somebody really had some heartburn about not being appointed, maybe they put in their application but didn't get appointed, and then just decided, well, all of this isn't really in code or isn't really legal anyway, so they could sue. And being that this is a new thing, we've never even attempted to do something like this before. If we did decide to approve either one of these, I can see where there could be challenges. So that gives me reason to pause as well. And I think when Mr. Dunbar brought up the issue of just the timing of things, even if we were to say, if we had approved the special election and we were actually having an election on January 26th, like the initial ordinance had proposed, we would be looking at potentially a runoff in February, and then it would be sometime in March before we were able to swear in a new mayor. So if you look at that period of time, you're still talking 5 months there, by which we would have had the assembly seat vacant without having any ability to do anything for filling the vacancy or getting the assembly member back in their position after the new mayor took over. So, you know, there's a lot to look at in terms of how we really do address this. But having said all that, that is one reason why I think if we go either route, it would need to be this temporary one, because we can do this really quickly. We don't impact code. And we basically just deal with this as a very unusual and a unique circumstance. So anyway, I know that probably doesn't help people a whole lot in terms of where they want to go with this. But it certainly highlights the situation that we have when we have a vacated seat, particularly for the mayor's seat. And I think it's absolutely critical that we deal more with that mayor seat vacancy issue on a long-term basis and try to streamline some of the ways forward with that. So I'm glad that Mr. Constant is already working on something, and look forward to having that discussion as well. But at this point, like I said, I'd like to see this temporary one done. Just do it, be done with it, and just recognize that it is meant to be a temporary thing, almost on an emergency ordinance basis. And, you know, and I looked at that too, just to kind of give a little bit of background on the idea of the assembly can do emergency ordinances, but they're tied to a 60-day maximum. So I'm not sure that would really help us in this situation. So anyway, I know I'm talking a little bit around and around on it about it, Mr. Chair, but it's problematic, and I think we have a lot to think about, and certainly some more work to do. So thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Zolotel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I pulled up the addendum resolution, which is fully within, I think, the context of what we're talking about here. And so I wanted to ask a few questions about that. One is I noticed, because what I understand this addendum resolution to be is if the ordinance passes, this particular process, if the resolution passes, would kick in. So I'm curious about the timing put forward in the resolution and if it's possible. The second is I just want to flag a concern I have in paragraph 1 in section 1, the word vacancy, or that the clerk issues a notice of vacancy. I just want to flag that for consistency if this goes with the ordinance, because the ordinance does not talk about vacancy, because we've all talked about the way the term is defined. And then the other thing I don't see in this addendum resolution that I would want a little bit of clarification on, or maybe it's something we would want to amend if we were moving through, is the date by which the particular term ends, or if we don't need to address that, because the way it functions in the ordinance, the term comes to a natural conclusion when the temporary emptiness of the seat concludes on its own. So I just wanted to raise those because we're not going to have another chance to talk about this addendum resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would you like to respond?
So the clerk's office, if they are prepared to about the timing, or Mr. Gates, and then that term vacancy, I just wanted to flag, and I presume Mr. Gates might have something to say about that.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Gates.
Yes, thank you. I'm not sure if the clerk's office is ready to respond to this. This was, I drafted this, and it was, I didn't have the time or opportunity to have the municipal clerk or deputy municipal clerk, Vinnie Clausen, participate in the drafting. So this is all me. First, I want to thank Mrs. Allenhill for pointing out that inconsistency in paragraph 1. So I used the resolution that that the Assembly passed to initiate the process when we appointed Mrs. Winehouse back in December 2018, and that's a remnant from that language that I missed to delete. So thank you. That will be coming out by either amendment or maybe clerically fixing this document. So thank you for pointing that out. That shouldn't be in there about the notice of vacancy. Excuse me, I'm going to share the document. And so just for clarity, this language is what I'm speaking of. That's an error, that's my drafting error, and that shouldn't be in there, so we will get that fixed. And then to go to the timing question, I guess the question was February 12th here about applications and so forth. And we worked out this timing in these paragraphs 1 through 5 back in 2018, actually in the summer when Mr. Steele resigned, and we first did the resolution, like, well, not first, but we did a resolution and drafted it this way. So that was our sort of starting template, and that's sort of the timing that we worked out. And I think this follows that similar time frames. And I do think that I am going to consult the municipal clerk and see if we need to put out a floor amendment to adjust any timing here Tuesday night. And if we do, you will see that. The work isn't quite done in terms of this. And like I said, it was a short time frame to get this submitted on the addendum. So I do want to explain, though, we have the January 26th meeting, and if this passes, the clerk is to publish a notice for 10 consecutive days, and the application deadline should be after that. So from January 26th for the 10 days, for February 12th, there would be, I think, about 6 days for the clerk to, comp up a notice and get it published. And publication that's defined in AMC here is posted in our public notices page. So it wouldn't be a matter of needing to put it in the newspaper and maybe having some timeline issue with getting it published in a newspaper. It would kind of be, once it's ready, it can be posted there. So I think that this February 12th deadline, if the 10 days or more, it's an at least number actually, that could be met, that the notice could be written up, drafted, finalized, and posted, and there would be enough days here to make this February 12th deadline for applications be achievable. And then from February 12th to the next meeting, where this paragraph 5 says that people will be interviewed and voted on, that is within, well, after the deadline for applications, the clerk has to make sure that all the applicants are qualified to hold the seat, and they need to be qualified similar to an assembly member, be a resident of the district, and a registered voter. So I think there will be enough time from February 12th to get those nominations and their qualifications verified before the meeting on the 23rd, because that's 11 days. And I believe that again, that timeline, a similar timeline was worked out with the municipal clerk's office 2 times in the past. And then I have this additional language here. And when we did an appointment with Mrs. Weimhoff, there was a special meeting called just for that purpose. And the assembly, they spent a bit of time asking the applicants questions and taking a careful time to consider and vet them and vote. And with the appointment of Mr. Perman, there was several rounds of voting. So it took a bit of time. So I put this in there as a contingency. If we don't want to do it during that regular meeting, among our other agenda items for that meeting, a special meeting can be called just for this appointment. And this just allows that to happen. And the February 26th date is 30 days after, we initiate the process, which sort of shows with the whole appointment process timing, which is to be within 30 days. So again, I do need to consult the clerk to see if we need to adjust anything. And if so, we'll have an amendment. I believe this all works though. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gates.
Thank you. Did you have anything else?
No, thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Perez-Rodillo?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't think I have anything else to add. I think all of my questions have been answered at this point. Yep, so I think I'm good. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, thank you. Just back on a point Mr. Gates made about the difficulty of filling that seat with Mr. Perman and Mr. Cubits, I think it was, from the railroad. I think that we implemented a ranked choice voting procedure, and it allows for 3 ballot votes and then a ranked choice vote. And so in any case, I don't think we are in for an hour and a half of tie votes.
Thank you. All right, is there any further discussion either about the resolution or just generally on this topic?
Mr. Chair. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Ms. Kennedy, and then I'll go to you, Mr. Perez-Rodillo.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I would just ask the assembly members to ask themselves the question, is there any validity to wanting to temporarily fill this seat until Austin Quinn Davidson comes back? And I think that's probably the primary question. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Perez-Rodillo?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm not sure if there are members of the public who would want to testify, and if you want to create any time for that. But I did hear that a few members from the west side of Anchorage were planning on attending the meeting today.
Sure. Do you have specific names?
I do not know.
Okay. Are there any West Anchorage residents?
Yes,
I'm sorry, Ms. Allard?
I apologize. Liz Vasquez looking to testify, Chair.
Sure. And just to clarify, this isn't testimony. There will be testimony on Tuesday. This is just adding to the discussion at this point, if you would like. So, Ms. Vasquez, are you on the line?
Yes, sir. Yes.
All right, go ahead.
The comment I have to make is we have a very peculiar situation since there was no special election to fill the mayor's position. But the charter is very, very precise in what constitutes a vacancy. And in section 7.01, it's a whole list of what constitutes a vacancy. If there's a resignation, if someone dies, judicially determined to be incompetent, but there are 6 situations in which a seat can be considered vacant. Of course, the situation we face now is not considered a vacancy. The proposal that Assemblyman Perez-Rodillo is discussing explicitly amends the charter through the back door. It adds another way of defining, quote, a vacancy. And it does so by, I'm looking at the second page, by amending the code, the municipal code. And the code is like the equivalent to state regulations. The charter is equivalent to the state constitution or the federal constitution. So there is a real distinction here. The proposal by Assemblywoman Kennedy and Allard is very defined to this very specific situation. And specifically it states, and I'm going to quote what it states here, but on a temporary basis. And the intent of this action is not to change charter or code in any way. So it's very explicit. There's no intent to change the charter, which will require a vote of the people. And it does not intend to change the code. Now, it's very specific what's going to happen. July 1, 2021, upon swearing of the newly duly elected mayor, acting mayor Quinn Davison returns to the assembly position. So that tenure, that term of service is very defined. On the other hand, the proposal to amend the code is wishy-washy, subject to many perhaps interpretations. For example, it states, I'm looking at the proposal, the third line down, second, we started the second. The assembly may determine to appoint a qualified person to fill the chair's assembly district seat, quote, during the period of service as acting mayor. That's very, very loose. The charter talks about serving the balance of a term. It doesn't refer to, quote, a period of service. And this is unclear. It's not as definitively defined as to what is going to happen, whereas the resolution does. And there is a question of transparency. The only proposal that was submitted to the Spenard and Turnagain community councils was the proposal discussed by Assemblyman Perez Verdiers. The resolution proposed by Assemblywoman Kennedy and Allard were never introduced or even discussed. In fact, members of the Sand Lake Community Council did not know about the resolution until the night before their
Ms.
meeting.
Vasquez?
We usually have our meetings on Monday, so we have a transparency issue.
Ms. Vasquez?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to wrap up. So if you have one short final point you'd like to make, a few sentences, happy to hear that.
I think that the best resolution would be to have a very, you don't want to, it's a slippery slope to amend the charter through the back door and to introduce a change to the code like this. The resolution addresses the specific issue and has sufficient guardrails to prevent any abusive use down the road. And I would say that the affected
Thank you so much, Ms. Vasquez. I'm going to have to cut you off. There's going to be public testimony on this on Tuesday if you'd like to sign up for testimony. I'm going to go in the queue, then we'll see if anyone else from West Anchorage would like to speak. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, thank you. Briefly, it was previously stated by someone at an earlier meeting that the charter is like the Constitution and that the code is like regulations. And I need to assert that that is factually incorrect. The charter is like the Constitution. The code is like the law because it is the law. And then regulations are in fact regulations. And so at the local level, we have the charter, which is the Constitution, the code, which is our laws, and then our regulatory system regulations are regulations. I just wanted to assert that that's in fact at the municipal level what's operating here.
Thank you. Are there any other West Anchorage residents who would like to comment now? Again, this is going to be up for public hearing on Tuesday, so you are more than welcome to sign up to testify on Tuesday as well. All right, not hearing anyone else. Again, I want to urge members to please, Mr. Perez-Verdia.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to, I just received an email from the chair of the Spenard Community Council, and I just want to read it for the record. She said, I just saw the information posted to the website for the information session, and we'll try to tune in. Our executive board had discussed the Kennedy-Allard resolution, and though we agreed with the goal of having Austin's seat filled, we didn't agree with the language and didn't think the mechanism in it would have done anything to address the quote vacant end quote seat issue. Spenard passed the resolution to support the ordinance, so we hope the language doesn't change too much. That was from the president of the Spenard Community Council. So I just want to make sure that her email got into the record. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. All right, with that, again, if members have any amendments or other changes, please get those in ASAP. Otherwise, we will have a public hearing and a vote on Tuesday. And with that, I will go ahead and close the work session and bid everyone a good weekend.